I'd now like to welcome our two witnesses here in person. We have Dr. Farzin Nadimi, who's a Senior Fellow with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And joining us virtually, we have Mr. Kasra Arabi, who is the Director of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Research Group. Thank you both for having joined us. You will each be provided 5 minutes for your opening remarks, after which we will open it to questions from the members. However, I would ask that you do look over to the screen and the monitor every once in a while, because if this is going up, that means you should really be wrapping up your comments or your response to members to questions posed by members within 10 to 15 seconds. That having been explained, we will go to Dr. Nadimi. Dr. Nadimi, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
For over 4 decades, the Islamic regime in Iran has founded and aggressively supported terrorism and terrorist organizations in the Middle East and defied international norms by conducting destabilizing activities with global repercussions. The roots of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, go back to the 1979 anti-status quo revolution in Iran, when a number of paramilitary terrorist groups merged to assume the role of an enforcer of the new regime. They targeted activists, rival political factions, and ethnic and religious minorities in line with the regime's monopolism and suppressive behavior. This role, protecting the revolution and its achievements, has inked into the new Iranian constitution's Article 150. In fact, according to the second charter of the IRGC, published in 1982, the Revolutionary Guard's main agenda is not only to safeguard the Islamic Revolution and its achievements, but also to continuously work toward realizing the God's will and expanding the rule of God as interpreted by the Supreme Revolutionary Leader and the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. So, the IRGC is one of the very few military forces in the world, perhaps the only one, that claims a direct connection with the Almighty through its chain of command. Throughout the 1980s and the Iran-Iraq War, the IRGC grew its arms into separate ground forces, Navy and Air Forces, Basij, and the Quds Force, the expeditionary branch of the IRGC. Quds Force has repeatedly been targeted with sanctions for its active role in supporting and leading terrorist organizations in recent years. But Quds Force is only one part of the whole. It is often boosted by other branches of the IRGC and answers directly to the highest levels of the chain of command in Iran. After spending almost a decade expanding both its defensive and offensive power, in early 2000s, the IRGC shifted its attention to fighting the United States and the West in general, which were by then engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also to defeat its self-declared enemy, namely the State of Israel. By following one of the basic principles of warfare, the economy of force, which means judicious employment and distribution of forces, Iran created and managed a network of proxy militant groups to do most of the fighting and dying for it. Iran has also increasingly relied on criminal gangs in target countries to target Iranian dissidents and journalists. The IRGC also has a powerful intelligence arm, the intelligence organization with extraordinary powers, undeclared prisons, and notorious reputation for locking up and torturing and raping political opponents. The IRGC's intelligence organization has a foreign operations branch, and it's especially involved in targeting foreign and Iranian citizens in countries like Turkey, and as a result has designated last year by the US Treasury. The IRGC is by design an anti-status quo ideological international force that seeks to alter regional and also international balance of power. Its extraterritorial role makes IRGC one of the main tools of the regime's state-sponsored terrorism beside the intelligence ministry. state-sponsored or directed terrorism is generally defined as government support or control of acts of international terrorism, usually by violent non-state actors with funding, training, hosting, directing, and supplying weapons to them. Those definitions rarely include a state that commits act of terrorism all by itself in a systematic manner. The IRGC does have such a quality in the form of its Quds Force, the same extraterritorial arm. Therefore, international terrorism is not a problem isolated to non-state actors or certain regions. It is a global problem. So is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, or the IRGC. The IRGC has also quickly went to work to export the revolution by supporting guerrilla movements around the world. Also, when the devastating Iran-Iraq war ended in 1988, with the IRGC, by the way, playing a very key role in prolonging it. The IRGC expanded exponentially, both as a conventional military organization, but also as a force to safeguard Islam and export the revolution. The U.S. Department of State has designated and sanctioned 4 countries, Cuba, North Korea, Iran, and Syria, as countries that have repeatedly provided support for acts of international terrorism pursuant to 3 specific laws. Under Iran, in April 2019, the State Department designated IRGC as instrumental in founding, training, and supplying Hezbollah, a group designated a foreign terrorist organization by the State Department and also by the Canadian government in 2002. While the Canadian government mainly sees the threat of terrorism originating from the 3 main components: violent Sunni Islamist extremism, both at home and abroad, international terrorist groups, and domestic issue-based extremism, it also admits to the changing nature of the terrorist threat facing Canada. It is now time to broaden this definition and clearly include state terrorism conducted directly by its main element of power. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We now go to Mr. Arabi. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Thank you. Honourable members, I testify before you today at a time when the threat from Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps jihadi terrorism has reached unprecedented levels in the West. In the past 72 hours, we at United Against Nuclear Iran have identified an individual at a rally in Toronto dressed in IRGC attire, threatening IRGC-inspired jihadi violence on Canada's streets. Despite the rising threat of IRGC terror, there is a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the IRGC, its violent Islamist extremist activities on Western soil, and how prescribing the IRGC will practically mitigate its ability to operate abroad, including in Canada. The IRGC is not a conventional armed force. It officially recognizes itself as an ideological organization with a, quote, ideological mission of jihad in God's way to spread Sharia law across the world. It operates no differently to prescribed Islamist extremist terrorist organizations, from ISIS and Al-Qaeda to Hezbollah. It has a formal program of indoctrination to radicalize all of its members and their families in a violent Islamist extremist ideology, which, as my research has revealed, calls on its members to wage armed jihad against Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians on the basis that they, quote, have unacceptable faith and must either convert to Islam or be killed. It also teaches its recruits that Iranians who oppose the Islamic regime in Iran are muharebs, are waging war against God, and must not just be killed, but must be tortured prior to their death. In a bid to make the IRGC a more ideologically pure and extremist force, Ayatollah Khamenei has increased indoctrination in the IRGC, which now makes up for more than 50% of its training. It has also restricted its conscript intake to members of the Basij paramilitary force, and has doubled down on the most extremist, Islamist, and anti-Semitic doctrine, namely the apocalyptic and militaristic doctrine of Mahdiism, which calls for the destruction of the State of Israel and the killing of Jews worldwide to facilitate the return of the so-called Messianic hidden Imam. These are not just empty actions. Look at the modus operandi of the IRGC: terrorism, hostage-taking, hijackings. In the past few years, the IRGC has increased its terrorist activities on Western soil. In 2022 alone, UK authorities announced that they had foiled more than 16 IRGC terrorist attacks on British soil. But the IRGC is not only conducting acts of terror, direct acts of terror in the West, it is also seeking to nurture homegrown Islamist radicalization and terrorism using tactics identical to that of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. We, at United Against Nuclear Iran, recently obtained and exposed videos of 8 IRGC commanders being hosted online by a London-based entity called the Islamic Students Association of Britain and Europe. In their online speeches, these commanders glorified IRGC terrorism, propagated extreme anti-Semitism, and even called on British Muslim students to join their, quote, apocalyptic army that will eradicate the lives of Jews everywhere in the world. This student body also has branches in Canada. Indeed, in 2023, an IRGC-affiliated propaganda anthem, Salute Commander, designed to radicalize children, was recorded on Canadian soil. These methods are identical to homegrown Islamist radicalization tactics used by ISIS and Al-Qaeda. But unlike ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which are prescribed terrorist organizations, the current sanctions regime on the IRGC does not prohibit its propaganda activities, nor does it prohibit its ability to disseminate jihadi propaganda. Prescribing the IRGC would fundamentally change this. Prescription would give the Canadian government a clear mandate to prohibit any activity, including propaganda activity, related to the IRGC. It would also provide Canada's local communities, including teachers, local police force, with the necessary safeguarding tools to identify and prevent against IRGC or Shia radicalization. At present, Canada's preventative program, designed to identify and prevent individuals becoming involved with terrorism through radicalization, is almost exclusively focused on Sunni Islamist extremism, meaning that IRGC and Shia Islamist extremist activities are blind spots. Prescribing the IRGC would fundamentally change this and equip Canada's communities with the ability to identify and prevent Shia and IRGC radicalization. In other words, the claim that prescribing the IRGC is just a symbolic move is entirely false. Prescribing the IRGC will have practical and meaningful consequences on the IRGC's ability to conduct its radicalization and terrorism activities on Canadian soil. This is a step the Canadian government must immediately consider. I speak as both an expert on the subject matter, but also as someone whose best friend, British-Iranian journalist Priya Zarati, was stabbed in London only a few months ago in an IRGC terror attack. The continued failure to prescribe the IRGC is putting Canadian lives at risk and poses a major national security threat to Canada. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now open it up to questions from the members. And first up is MP Epp. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to both of the witnesses for your testimony. I'll start with you, Mr. Nadimi. You referenced the IRGC's judicial use of force. And so they're acting with proxies, are acting in concert with other, the Houthis, the Hamas, Hezbollah, etc. So how much would actually those groups that some of which we've already listed as terrorist entities, how much would we diminish them by simply going after IRGC? I mean, what is the level of coordination through, it's been coined the axis of resistance?
Well, the axis of resistance, even if at some levels there is a loose connection, more coordination, given the existing technologies to communicate, but at the same time, Iran has been investing for years to arm these groups and to train them, to encourage them, and to together to plan for situations exactly like the Houthis have been involved in since last November. So even if there is not a day-to-day operational planning involving both Iranians and Houthis, for example, or Hamas fighters, these kinds of planning have been done for years, and that includes October 7 operations, that the horrendous terrorist action by the Houthis, by the Hamas on October 7th. Even if Iran was not directly involved in that particular day and that particular operation, for years Iran has sponsored Hamas and has helped them arm and train for this exact reason.
Do you have a comment on this as well?
Sorry, did you say, do I have a comment?
Go ahead.
Yeah, there is. Well, the IRGC has manufactured various proxy groups in the Middle East, and there is a significant level of coordination, particularly with those IRGC manufactured groups. These are groups that the Revolutionary Guard has created from scratch and has spent a significant amount of capital, not only training, arming and funding their fighters, but also radicalizing their recruits in the same ideology as the Revolutionary Guard. In relation to the Houthis, we at United Against Nuclear Iran identified the Behzad intelligence ship, which is an intelligence ship that the IRGC owns and operates, and has directly been providing intelligence to the Houthis to conduct attacks, terror attacks against commercial shipping, as well as US and its allies' ships in the Persian Gulf. The level of coordination is there, and even if you monitor in the months and actually the years leading up to the October 7th terrorist attacks, we see that the changes to the IRGC's personnel, changes to the IRGC's doctrines, and broader military security infrastructure of the regime in Iran indicated that the IRGC was preparing for a major confrontation with Israel. So all the IRGC...
Sorry to interrupt. I'm just so short of time. Now let's bring this to our shores. Allegations of 700 militants acting in concert with the IRGC here on Canadian soil. Allegations that the IRGC is working with Hells Angels here and in the U.S. Can you comment on their level of integration, their level of control, their level of activity right here on our Canadian soils?
Yeah, the IRGC has three ways of operating when it comes to terrorism. The first is direct terrorist attacks, when it sends its operatives to conduct these operations. There is a strong track record for this. As well as this, it uses armed gangs, which it has been using increasingly more so than before. As well as that, it also uses the same methods as ISIS and Al-Qaeda, whereby it has nurtured a social constituency in Canada, in the US, in the United Kingdom, and has used the same methods as ISIS Al-Qaeda to radicalize them using the networks affiliated with the regime in Iran, from religious centers to mosques to community centers to schools, as a means to radicalize local Canadian nationals, local British nationals, radicalize them and recruit them for operations. Homegrown Islamist extremism is an increasing threat that the IRGC poses. And the current sanctions regime does not prohibit against that.
Okay, and so practically speaking, if we list them, as we should, as a terrorist entity, practically, how will that diminish their activities in Canada?
Absolutely. Practically speaking, as I explained in my testimony, the current sanctions regime does not prohibit the IRGC's ability to disseminate its propaganda or disseminate its jihadi propaganda activities. Soft power activities under the current sanctions regime are not covered. Unlike ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which are prescribed terrorist organizations, prescribing the IRGC would give the Canadian government a full mandate to prohibit any activity, including propaganda and soft activity, related to the IRGC. As well as this, it would equip Canadian local communities, the local police force, the local schools, with the necessary tools to identify and prevent against Shia and IRGC radicalization. Again, the current preventative program in Canada, like Britain, like the European Union, is exclusively focused on Salafi jihadism, Sunni Islamist extremism. Prescribing the IRGC would fundamentally change that. And, as I said, would equip Canadian local communities with the ability to identify and prevent against Shia and IRGC radicalization. Previously in my testimony, I mentioned that we at United Against Nuclear Iran, in the past 72 hours, identified an individual, a Canadian individual, at a rally in Toronto, dressed in IRGC attire and threatening IRGC-inspired violence on Canada's streets. So this is ongoing. It's a major problem, and the current sanctions regime does not prohibit it.
Thank you.
Thank you. We now go to MP Oliphant. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both our witnesses. Without casting any doubts on anything you're saying, I'd like to understand how you gather both your intelligence and your evidence. Strong statements being made on exactly what's happening. I feel like I'm speaking to intelligence officers or people who are engaged in that activity. For both of you, I'm just wondering, how do you get your information? How is it verified by double source? How is it? How do you get it?
I'm born in Iran. I've lived in Iran and studied and worked in Iran. And I did my military service in Iran until 2005 when I moved to Britain to study. I did a master's degree in war studies. I did a PhD degree in Middle Eastern studies at the University of Manchester and King's College London. And then I moved to Canada for a year. I was a visiting fellow at the University of York. Then
I'm not questioning your qualifications. I'm just understanding your research, current research, and your intelligence sources and how it's verified.
Well, I do not have access to classified intelligence, but as a senior fellow of the Washington Institute for Nearest Policy, we constantly talk with intelligence and people from intelligence community, and also from the administration, and other Iranian and who have primary knowledge of the IRGC's operations. And from an analytical point, many of these contents of this statement that I made was analytical, based on information that is readily available.
Go to Mr. Arabi now with the same question.
Yes, like Farzin, I'm an Iranian. I've been looking at and studying the IRGC for more than a decade. And through my expertise and time as working on the IRGC, I've developed a network of contacts inside of Iran, as well as being able to identify locations on the online space where the IRGC is active and has provided open source information. Through such means, both through networks on the ground, as well as knowing where to look, I've been able to maintain a constant flow of primary information, primary data, primary Farsi material, primary IRGC material, and as a means through which I have been able to assess this primary IRGC material and therefore publish on the subject. For example, I have obtained the internal training manuals the IRGC has used to radicalize its recruits, as I referenced in my testimony. And I've always ensured that my analysis is centered on primary material, primary Farsi material, specifically in relation to the IRGC.
I want to move on a little bit more. I'm a Canadian, but I don't have access to Canadian intelligence, so I'm just trying to figure that out. I want to follow up on Mr. Epps' I think, very good line of questioning with respect to the so-called axis of resistance. You didn't talk about money. Is there money that flows from the IRGC? Do you track it? Do you understand the relationship, the financial or resource relationship between the IRGC and or the Quds Force and Hezbollah and Hamas or the Houthis or any other groups? Is there information about how that happens? Mr. Nadimi first.
A lot of that information is in the open source, and yes, Iran and IRGC funds Quds Force operations, because Quds Force is a branch of the IRGC, and Quds Force.
But from Quds Force to the proxies, is there? I don't imagine they publish their bank account, their financial statement. So
well. According to the statements made by the Iranian officials themselves and many of those proxy groups leaders, like Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh, when they visit Iran, they usually carry suitcases full of cash. And when Qasem Soleimani, before he was killed by U.S. military operation in Iraq, visited those countries, or Syria mostly, they carried cash, and there were regular flights, cargo flights from Iran to those countries, and those flights also transported cash and gold.
That's illegal activity, though, regardless of what.
I'm afraid you're out of time.
Of course,
they were. Because those groups are terrorist organizations. So, if we have proof of that, it should be reported.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Let's go to MP Bergeron. You have 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being with us today. And thank you for enlightening us with your comments. as well as your experience and your studies. I'd say that to date, there seems to be some consensus from the witnesses about the idea of listing the IRGC in the list of terrorist entities in Canada. Last week, we heard a rather iconoclastic testimony from Professor Rabudi from the University of Ottawa, who said that while recognizing that, on the one hand, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is likely engaging in terrorist activities, and despite the fact that they would have to be ultimately included in the list, in Canada's list of terrorist entities, he was saying that the time is not ripe now, that there would be a circumstantial issue, which would mean that now is not the time to do this, because in the context of the current war in the Middle East, this would affect the credibility of Canada in the global south. What do you think of that? I address my question to both witnesses. Perhaps, Mr. Nadimi, you could begin.
Sir, I think it's a responsibility of all the free world and Western nations to tackle this problem because the IRGC is a growing problem. They are adaptive complex system. They adapt to existing situations, and we have to design and plan for measures against them accordingly. With any days that any days of inaction in IRGC's growing operations and growing abilities, both conventional weapons and also their terrorist operations, I think we will be a loss for the free world because they will be more capable and they will expand their activities in the region and beyond. Yesterday, there was this report that the Houthis have established a working relationship with the Al-Shabaab group in Somalia. Al-Shabaab group is a Sunni terrorist Al-Qaeda affiliated group. Houthis are a Zaydi Shiite affiliated with Iran, and now mostly with this consent of the Iranian sponsors of Houthis, they are establishing a relationship so the Houthis can provide Al-Shabaab with more sophisticated, longer range, more lethal weapons. Probably if for the time that in the future, if Houthis stand down, Houthis can, Al-Shabaab in Somalia can take over their job.
Donc, si je comprends bien, selon...
So if I understood you correctly, in your opinion, the argument saying that now is not the right time should not be a consideration in Canada's decision-making?
I think it is the right time. That probably it's even too late, or not too late, but late for making such decisions. I think it's about time for Canada to designate IRGC in line with other countries like United States, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and European Parliament declare IRGC as a terrorist organization.
Monsieur Arabi, qu'est-ce que vous en pensez?
Mr. Arabi, what do you think?
This is absolutely the right time. When we're talking about prescription, first and foremost, this is about Canada's national security. This is an interior ministry issue. There is a serious threat of IRGC terrorism and IRGC homegrown radicalization, homegrown extremism, homegrown terrorism in Canada. The current sanctions regime on the IRGC does not prohibit its ability to disseminate jihadi propaganda, nor does it prohibit its ability to carry out soft power activities, which we know they are doing in Canada, which we know they have cultivated a social constituency in Canada. Just in this past 72 hours, we've had a Canadian individual dressed in IRGC attire making IRGC-inspired violent gestures at other Canadians in Toronto. So first and foremost, beyond the foreign policy aspect of this, prescription relates to the national security of Canada and the protection of Canadian civilians. It is absolutely fundamental that Canada prescribes the IRGC to protect against the threat of IRGC terrorism on Canadian soil. That is the most pressing issue here. This isn't, when we're talking about prescription, it is primarily an interior ministry issue. It's about national security. And the current sanctions regime on the IRGC in Canada does not protect against IRGC terrorism on Canadian soil. So it is absolutely essential to do this sooner rather than later.
Now go to MP McPherson. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And this is an important study. I'm very grateful for the witnesses for being here today. Before I ask some questions, I just have to do a little bit of housekeeping. I need to move a motion and read it into the record, not for voting on or dealing with right now, but I do want to just get it on the record. The notice of motion, and we will share it with the members shortly. That, pursuant to Standing Order 108.2, the committee conduct a study on Canada-India relations with particular focus on human rights of minorities in India and Canada's arms sales to India. That the study consist of at least 4 meetings, that the Minister of Foreign Affairs be invited to appear, and that the committee invite witnesses from Canadian civil society and international human rights organizations. That the committee reports its findings to the House, and that pursuant to Standing Order 109, the government table a comprehensive response to the report. Thank you, and we'll send that out to the members in both official languages. Thank you very much, Dr. Nadimi, for being here today and for sharing your thoughts with us. One of the things that I brought this motion forward to do and to have this study was to understand the implications of listing the IRGC as a terrorist organization. You've made it clear that you think that it is, if not now, too late or getting late. We should have done this much sooner. And we had testimony from somebody earlier this week that talked about the fact that Canada wasn't using the tools that we already had effectively. So my concern is this doing one more thing badly when we are already not using the sanction regime adequately? We are already not enforcing, using the tools that we have at our disposal. What is your sense on how effective it would be if we don't have that enforcement mechanism in place?
Thank you very much for having me and inviting me to this important session. I think that robust legislation has always been very effective, even if there are existing measures. The very reason that the problem still persists means that there is still room for robust legislation. With regard to the IRGC, and existing power in Canada, yes, probably the RCMP already has special powers, but I think with more resources, they can do much better, and especially with better intelligence, they can foresee activities that these actors might have in mind on the Canadian side.
Thank you. Well, and the sanction regime is something I've been concerned with for a long time because it is becoming a larger piece of our foreign policy, but yet we have not invested in the enforcement of those sanctions or to make sure that those sanctions are being taken seriously. And I do wonder, from your perspective, the sanctions that we already have in place, have they had a demonstrable effect on Iran? Has Iran found ways to sidestep those? Has there been any impact to date?
Well, Iran and the Islamic regime in Iran has always been, in many cases, has been able to circumvent sanctions, adopt to existing sanctions, create measures to bypass some of the sanctions. But the very existence of sanctions and sanctions regimes, I think, has a very important psychological effect foremost. And also, with regard to IRGC, I think it will have a very positive effect on the Iranian people also. that have been subjected to IRGC's nefarious activities for decades. With regard to Canada, I think yes, it is very important that the government is also committed to any legislation that covers this issue, but there are rooms for implementing and adapting, and I think the Iranian community in the Iranian Canadian community, for example, in Ontario and Toronto, knows how much this can cut into with regard to activities and the influence that IRGC and Shiite fundamentalism has especially on Iranian Canadian communities.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Now we go to the second round, and first off is Abi Abul Taif. You get 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the witnesses, and welcome on board. Mr. Arabi, would you be able to tell us who's the partners of IRGC in Canada? If you'd be able to name organizations, would be great.
There are several entities. One of the most concerning entities is the presence of the Islamic Students Association of Canada. This entity, as I mentioned, is directly part of the Office of the Supreme Leader, Office of the Supreme Leader Beta Rahbari structure, and has had direct contact with IRGC commanders in the UK branch of the Islamic Students Association, hosted 8 IRGC commanders, whereby these IRGC commanders propagated and glorified IRGC terrorism. They propagated extreme anti-Semitism, and they even called on British Muslim students and European Muslim students to join their apocalyptic army that will, quote, end the lives of Jews everywhere in the world. Now, this association has a branch in Canada. We have also seen there are entities in Canada that have been propagating IRGC-affiliated propaganda anthems. As I said, Salute Commander. Salute Commander was a propaganda anthem that was created in Iran by the IRGC.
Beyond propaganda, to Mr. Nadimi, can you name organizations that are doing money laundering, doing drugs, doing weapons, feeding outflowing money to IRGC and to the Iranian regime? Can you name organizations, please, Mr. Nadimi? Yes, of course. Yes.
No, I cannot. But the money exchanges in Toronto.
So we don't have any idea how large the network in Canada.
I cannot comment on that. But as I mentioned, the money exchanges in Toronto have means to directly exchange money with Iran, and that can easily be exploited by the IRGC and any Iranian government members.
So to combat this organization in Canada, it seems like across the world, but we need to worry about Canada the most. You think we are serious about doing this, and do we understand totally how big and how serious our enemy, in order to be able to find the proper resources to fight it?
I cannot comment on that.
You do understand the mindset of IRGC since you were born in Iran, and that's probably a beginning to understand how big the challenge is.
The IRGC, by design, is an international organization. They export the revolution, and that still persists, that the ideology of exporting the revolution, expanding the rule of the Vilayat Faqih throughout the world and creating this Islamic civilization, the ideal Islamic civilization by the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei is not just as a theory. The IRGC has been assigned by the Supreme Leader, and that's official, to implement his ideas and his doctrine. So influence the IRGC has been trying to establish in Canada because of the large Iranian-Canadian community.
Do you think they are deep-rooted within the community itself and the communities that they can speak to well, or even beyond that community they might have branched out to have that fundamental challenge, to bring that fundamental challenge in Canada on the security and economy and other situations?
For and foremost, the focus of IRGC in Canada is on the Iranian-Canadian community foremost, and also the dissidents, the Iranian dissidents that live in Canada, and also any organization or NGOs organization that has any kind of focus on the plight of the Iranian
But they are
people.
also the threat to the to the overall Canadian society beyond the community, aren't they?
Yes, because the Iranian-Canadian community is an integral part of the Canadian
What's the
society.
consequences of fighting them versus just staying quiet on dealing with them?
Mentioned, the IRGC is an adaptive, complex system. They adapt to new conditions and situations, and they have shown the ability to increase their role, to increase their presence, and that has been the case in Canada and in many other countries that do have an Iranian diaspora.
I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take the next segment. If I could start off with Mr. Arabi. First of all, I should say the interpreters are advising that your volume is very high. If you could kindly turn it down a bit before you respond to this question. My question was, you touched on an incident in the UK, a terrorist attack, that was orchestrated by the IRGC. Given that most members here aren't familiar, could you give us more examples, whether it be in the UK or more broadly throughout Europe? That's the first question. And the second one is, if you could perhaps advise us as to why the government, the British government, never chose to prescribe the IRGC. If you could turn up the volume, my apologies. I think you're muted.
Sorry. Yes, I was muted. Apologies. The two main targets of IRGC terrorism across the world are the Iranian diaspora community and the Jewish community. The IRGC is the most anti-Semitic organization in the world, and a big part of its focus is targeting the Jewish community abroad. In the UK, the IRGC has carried out surveillance identifying Jewish targets, has created a hit list for Jewish community members. Similarly, in Germany, they have done the same. They have targeted also Jewish synagogues, Jewish kindergartens, as well as targeting Iranian diaspora members. They have been pushing and trying to mainstream anti-Semitism across Europe, across North America, and as well as targeting, directly conducting these terror plots and terror attacks. Unfortunately, the majority, fortunately, have been foiled by British security authorities. They have also, as I have said, have been nurturing homegrown radicalization. I think this really goes to the point. The current sanctions regime on the IRGC does not prohibit its radicalization activities. So it's using the same methods as ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but unlike ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which are prescribed terrorist organizations, the current sanctions regime does not prohibit the IRGC's ability to nurture homegrown radicalization, and it is specifically targeting not the Iranian diaspora community, because the overwhelming majority of Iranians who live abroad oppose the Islamic Republic, oppose the IRGC, but they are targeting the Shia community abroad. So that's a sizable community. They are targeting Shias, for example, in Britain, the British Shia Iraqis, British Shia Lebanese, British Shia Afghanistanis, British Shia Pakistanis. So they have built
I'm
an
so
Islamist
sorry, I have
constituency.
limited time. So if you could also kindly explain to us why the British government has yet to prescribe the IRGC.
I think it's an abject failure in British policy, and I think that the opposition has already pledged that it will prescribe the IRGC as a terrorist organisation as a priority. There was in Britain a visible disagreement between the Home Office and the Foreign Office, and the Home Office was in favour of prescribing the IRGC, rightly so, because first and foremost, the prescription of the IRGC is an interior ministry issue. It is about British national security, the protection of British citizens. Unfortunately, the Foreign Office opposed the move and was able to block it. However, there is hope. At least the opposition party, which is predicted to win the election. Of course, we can't predict elections, but the polling shows that they have pledged that they will prescribe the IRGC as an immediate foreign policy priority and domestic security issue.
For that, now if I could go to Dr. Nadimi. Mr. Arabi did explain some of the practical consequences that will follow should the IRGC be prescribed in Canada. Could you elaborate on that as well? In your opinion, what would the consequences be?
The IRGC has a naval branch, the IRGC Navy, which operates small missile boats and a large number of them, and also has recently commissioned missile corvettes. They have the control of the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz and the shipping lanes to and from the strategic water lane. I think one possible repercussion could be targeting of Canadian flag or Canadian affiliated ships that use the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz or the Gulf of Oman by measures such as seizures and other intrusive activities. Even it can be more serious actions could be considered.
Thank you very much for that. Now we go to MP Bergeron. You have 2.5 minutes, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. In an article published in the Washington Institute dealing with the increased tensions in the Middle East, you explained, as referring to the Iranian people, it's essential to note that the Iranian regime's acts do not reflect the wishes of their population, most of whom want peaceful coexistence with other countries in the region. My very simple question is this: how far does the regime's propaganda, for example, about the State of Israel, to what extent does this propaganda receive, is well received? Is it well received by the Iranian population? And based on the context that you have in the country, how have the people reacted to the attack by Iran against Israel?
The Iranian regime does have some support base. There are differences on the percentage. Some people count as many as 9 to 10% of support base among the Iranian people. But in general, I can sum up the reaction of the Iranian people, especially those that oppose the regime, as indifference. However, those that do support the regime, of course, they're very in very celebratory mood, because after over 40 years of self-declared war, against Israel. Finally, the regime had a chance to launch missiles and drones and cruise missiles from the Iranian territory against Israel, Israeli proper, and that was considered a major achievement, given the fact that ultimately Israeli response was very measured. So those who supported the regime were very happy about it, and obviously the majority of Iranian people who do not support the regime were indifferent. Or in many cases, on social media, they went on social media to offer support to the Israelis.
Thank you. We next go to MP McPherson. You have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm interested in knowing about the impact that your research has had on both of you, actually. Could you tell me whether researchers like you have whether you feel that you're at risk because of your work, in the same way that we've seen that other critics of the IRGC have been put at risk? Perhaps I'd start with you, Dr. Nadimi.
Well, obviously, any analyst of Iranian heritage has been subjected to some social media activities by the supporters of the regime, and I was no exception to that. I have not been able to go to Iran since 2014, the last time that I visited Iran, and I have been aware of obviously the risks, but. Yes, there are risks, especially for the journalists who cover Iran, especially those networks the Persian language networks based in Europe and in the United States. They have been subjected to harassment by the Iranian regimes, but with regard to analysts, that differs.
Dr. Arabi or Mr. Arabi?
The short answer is yes, and without going into too much detail due to the sensitivity, I've had in-person, for example, surveillance conducted, regular recipient of death threats, have had regular cyber and malware hacking attempts directed from the regime in Iran and the IRGC. Again, it's just, I'm one of many, certainly not the exception, and the threat is increasing against Iranian diaspora members who are outspoken against the regime, who conduct research, particularly on the security, military, intelligence apparatus. And unfortunately, Iranian diaspora members no longer feel safe in the West. And that is the sad reality. And I think that reflects the abject failure in Western policy to take action against the regime in Iran, choosing instead to negotiate with it, which has really set a precedent. The regime in Iran believes that it can carry out attacks, it can intimidate, and can conduct these acts of terror without facing any consequences. And that really goes to the root of the problem. Until the regime in Iran believes that it can get away with this, my sad prediction is that this will only increase. Given the sizable Iranian diaspora community in Canada, I believe this is a major threat, and prescription can help mitigate against it.
Thank you very much. That concludes our questions. At this point, on behalf of all the members, I just want to thank you, Dr. Nadimi and Mr. Arabi. Very, very grateful for your expertise and for your time. So I will suspend for a couple of minutes so we can ensure that our next slate of witnesses can make it to the table.
Thank you very much.